Recently, I bought and played Refunct on a whim. It was on sale and it looked interesting. Why not? What struck me about the game is its simplicity. The only challenge is the movement, and the only reward is pulling it off to make for more ground to move around on. It's very simple, rather relaxing, and works both at speed and as a slow meditative experience. But all that really matters is the movement. It's no secret that movement is hugely important in most games, so Refunct, with its pure focus on movement, got me thinking about movement in games in general, and more specifically, how it is used. To structure this discussion, I will look at two major ways in which movement is used to create a fun experience: fun through accessibility and fun through mastery. Refunct falls into the first category. Although double jumps, wall jumps, and a few physics-based elements might be odd for someone totally new to games, to someone that's played at least one movement-based game, it's very simple. All of the maneuvers are pretty easy to pull off, and very predictable each time, and the game as a whole never really challenges you. That's not to say that challenge, or the lack of it, is what makes a movement system accessible. Personally, I think that the movement in Super Meat Boy is incredibly easy and accessible, while the game itself is awfully hard. The challenge comes from applying simple movements and actions in a difficult and precise manner. Now, the movement in Super Meat Boy is more complex than Refunct's, but it isn't punishing. It's very easy to move in any given level, and the movement is fun enough to encourage you to continue while dying again and again on the way to that goal. The movement is fun for its fast shifts in direction. You won't slip or slide a pixel more than you want to, and momentum and trajectories and jumps are very easy to change compared to many other games, specifically the ones I'll mention in the second half of this video. Again, just because the movement is accessible doesn't mean it is easy, and just because it's easy to apply each individual movement doesn't mean it's easy to apply them all in sequence. Super Meat Boy should never be considered easy, even if I describe it as accessible. It's easily one of the hardest games I've played, even if it is very easy to pick up. For this reason, I think the movement is accessible and fun because of it, while the game as a whole is very difficult. So now, after looking at two examples of movement systems that are fun because of their accessibility, I want to discuss two examples that become fun once you've mastered them. Super Meat Boy's antithesis, then, is Mirror's Edge, a game that as a whole is fairly easy, but the movement is somewhat difficult. The reason I think the movement is difficult, when the game as a whole, a game focused heavily on movement, is fairly easy, is because the movement is somewhat punishing. Certain jumps can't be made without some speed behind you. Momentum and speed is difficult to maintain, and the real joy of the game comes from linking and successfully pulling off a series of moves, not from completing a level. It's why I find more fun in going back to the race and time trial modes than replaying the game as a whole. It's fun to master the movement and pull off harder alternate routes, while the narrative drive of the main game is pretty weak. Although it is pretty easy to complete the game without mastering the movement, there's not a lot of fun to be had if you don't. Mind you, the movement and flow to Mirror's Edge is insanely fun when you do master it. Pulling off a wall run that you transition from into a wall jump without losing momentum, or simply chaining a sequence of longer jumps is wonderfully satisfying, let alone what better players can do with the systems. If Mirror's Edge is the antithesis of Super Meat Boy, then N++ is perhaps its closest comparison. Like Super Meat Boy, N++ is a tough-as-nails 2D platformer based on an older Flash game, and like Super Meat Boy, it enjoys a certain infamy for its difficulty. Unlike Super Meat Boy, however, N++'s movement is brutally punishing. The slightest change in momentum and angle will completely change your jump's trajectory, and when fall damage will instantly kill you, that's a big deal. Additionally, all of your movements are floaty. Each movement carries weight, and you'll find yourself skidding and sliding if you try to quickly change your direction or speed. Unlike Meat Boy's uncanny ability to speed up and slow down instantly, it takes time both to build up and reduce your speed in N++, and your movement as a result looks awkward and strange, at least until you master it. Once you do understand the feel of the physics at play here, and begin to get a grasp on the need to think 2 or 3 jumps in advance, so that you have the right kind of momentum when you need it, you feel like a platforming god. Not because it was easy to get there, not because it looks good no matter how you are playing, but because you needed to earn every jump, every movement, and every victory by mastering the movement systems. As far as fun through mastery goes, N++ is as close to a perfect movement system as any I've come across. Or at least it would be if it were not for the final example I will discuss. A movement system that has both the depth to satisfy those who want to master it and the accessibility to appeal to almost anyone. I'm talking about the movement in Team Fortress 2. Here, I must acknowledge that this video is far from comprehensive. I could talk about each of the games I've already discussed for a whole video quite easily, but that would be a little ridiculous, and to properly and completely cover the movement in TF2, I would almost need a whole video per class, which I'm certainly not experienced enough to do. So this segment of the video will describe TF2's movement in broad strokes and general terms. There will be specific details for individual classes that might change from my discussion, so if there are any terms that apply to a particular class you might love, feel free to discuss them in the comments below. First of all, there's the surface layer of TF2's movement. The one that's accessible and simple. The one everyone interacts with when they first boot up the game. WASD movements control your forward, left, backwards and right movements, while the mouse controls where you look, just like in almost every other FPS. On top of that, there are a few additions that are somewhat common but not endemic to first-person games, such as the Scout's double jump or explosive jumping as Soldier or Demoman, which is where the depth begins to become obvious. As someone that tends to play Demoman or Soldier more than the other classes, this is where I personally notice the depth. When you jump or detonate your sticky, when you crouch or where you shoot your rocket will all affect your jump's height, speed or trajectory. These concepts alone are difficult to get used to, but on top of that there are more advanced concepts such as chaining jumps or pogoing, C-tapping and sinking rockets that add huge amounts of complexity. Complexity that I can barely even skim the surface of at just over 150 hours on Soldier and just under 250 hours on Demoman. That complexity is there in every class too. Spy mains know the power of the Matador stab, and everyone else knows the frustration of being killed by them. Engineers with various unlocks can now sentry jump and retrieve their sentries from a distance, where once sentries couldn't even be moved after first placement. On that note, I need to acknowledge that TF2 has grown in mechanical complexity, its movement included, since it was first released. Pyros can now reflect a soldier's rocket to explosive jump themselves, or use the detonator to make their own jumps. Scouts can triple jump, or heavies can move slightly faster with certain unlocks equipped, and the medic can latch onto the speed of faster classes. It gets to the point where players with over 10,000 hours in-game can still make mistakes on rollouts and jumps because the skill ceiling for them is unbelievably high. All of that is without even mentioning the skills you develop with your aim after you understand movement and timing. Airshots are still rare enough for me that I still feel a huge rush after nailing one, but they are only so rewarding for the knowledge you needed to build up to get there. I need to understand how the physics of movement work in order to hit those difficult shots, so your work is rewarded at every level. First, simply getting used to movement and independent aiming. Then, additional or more complex movements on top of the basics. And finally, applying your understanding of the movement systems to predict in other players. At every stage, the movement systems are core to the game, while always supporting the aim or mouse movements that make up the other main mechanical core of the game. These two cores all then filter down and contribute to the other skills TF2 requires, such as map knowledge, which will inform where to go or where to aim. For those reasons, and for many others I couldn't mention in this video for sake of length, I think TF2's movement is the best I have ever come across. I think movement is hugely important to the joys games can offer, whether it is simple and relaxing like Refunct, or accessible and precise like Super Meat Boy. Whether it rewards mastery by maintaining flow or momentum like Mirror's Edge or N++, or if it rewards the simplest and most complex movement at every stage of learning, like the movement in TF2, movement is hugely important, and hopefully this video might have piqued your interest in the movement systems in games. If you have any other uses of movement that you thought of as particularly interesting or particularly good, especially if they're outside the first person and platforming genres I focused on in this video, please let me know in the comments. Let's start a discussion. And while you're there, let me know if there's anything I can do to improve these videos. Cheers, have a good one. Half-Life was one of the first games I played. There was at least 3 other games before it that I finished to completion, but games weren't a huge part of my life yet. Now, as of posting this video, I'm 21. I didn't play Half-Life when I was young, certainly not when it first came out, and by the time I finally did play it, the visuals were quite dated. My first glimpse of Half-Life was on a classmate's laptop. I was in year 9 and we'd all